Okay, so we're going live. We should be live now. So welcome everyone to the October 14th, 2020 edition of our MIT Enterprise Forum community stream. We're really lucky this month actually because this is our second event this month, and we've got Vlad Lokshin with us today. We're really fortunate to talk to him about something called fractional hiring, which is a concept that I know nothing about personally, but we're going to learn more. And as you saw from our title today, the event is called Fractional Hiring, Efficient Growth. And Vlad is here today with us as the co-founder and CEO of Turtle, which is a fractional hiring platform for startups. Vlad has an MBA from Cornell Tech, where he was part of the first graduating class, and BS degrees in engineering and business from the University of Maryland. And I know he's located in New York City actually with us now, so he's a local at the moment. And I think you moved back here actually from San Francisco, so welcome back to the city.
That's right. Good to be back.
Yeah, and yeah, we're really lucky to have you, and thanks for joining us today. And Vlad, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more and actually take it from here and tell us more about fractional hiring. So,
awesome. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you and gang putting this together, and everybody that's listening in. Thank you for spending your time with us and learning about fractional hiring. I'm going to pull up slides actually.
Yes, perfect.
1 second. Just give me a thumbs up once you can see my screen. All right, so first off, thank you for the intro, and hi, I'm Vlad. The reason I'm here is Cornell Tech and getting an MBA from Cornell Tech and meeting again there. So thank you again for having me, and yeah, I can't say enough about Cornell Tech and the connections I've been able to make there, including sitting here. So as you said, I'm one of the co-founders at Turtle. So at Turtle, we built a fractional hiring platform, starting with a way for startups to hire freelance software developers. And out of that, we developed our own platform that combines task management, chat, and billing, and makes it really easy to hire fractionally. So our vision is you're able to send a link and get to work, and all the back office and nonsense stuff of having to work together is handled for you through our software. Jumping over specifically to fractional hiring, let's start first with just traditional hiring, and typically, if from what I hear, most of the audience are either entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs within larger companies that might want to start your own companies one day or take on entrepreneurial projects inside your own organization. So traditional hiring looks something like this. Over time, as you get more money, as you grow bigger and have bigger problems to solve, you're really hiring one person at a time. And this concept has been around for a while, where basically you're hiring one person, they're working 40 hours a week, and you're expecting them to have long-term commitments. Typically, there's a long onboarding process. You're working them for years, not weeks, if everything goes well. And this concept has been around for quite some time. It actually has its roots in the Industrial Revolution, and at the turn of the century, children worked too long in labor factories. We used to work a lot more than 8 hours a day. The average workday was about 16 hours in the early 1800s, which then in some places went down to 8 hours. And then by about 1920, there was about a standard 40-hour, 8-hour a day work week. And that made a lot of sense when children were working too long in factories. But I think it may have gotten a little outdated, at least for all kinds of work. So what we're going to talk about today is hiring piecemeal. So we're not replacing core hiring. We don't think that is possible. Like you still need to have a core team to set your strategy, to set your direction. But outside of that, not everything necessarily requires a full-timer. So flexible hiring is, instead of thinking of just adding one person at a time, it's thinking about one person or a group of people that might work anywhere from theoretically 1 hour to full-time or more than full-time per week if it's more than just one person, and having flexible commitments. You're not necessarily engaging for years at a time, and that gets more difficult with a flexible arrangement, but you're figuring out constructs to make that work for a shorter term arrangement. So essentially, it's thinking about piecing together your team and your organization like this, with some core team members who are setting strategy, who are setting direction, but having part-timers and flex people for a lot of other things. An example of this in software is if you have a software startup and you might have an iPhone app, an Android app, and a web application. Traditionally, either you've hired a full-timer and stretched them very thin across all three platforms, or you've hired one person to cover kind of each bucket. Neither of those works really well for startups, because if you've already got an iPhone app, to have an Android app version of it really doesn't require a full-timer. So that's just one example of, if you're an early stage startup building on multiple platforms, that's exactly the kind of place where fractional hiring could work. So yeah, in summary, it's not everything requires a full-timer. That's the core concept here. As an example, this is Jason. He's a non-technical founder. This is his team at a company called Craft Coalition. He has hired on Turtle specifically. He learned how to design himself. He learned how to lead a team himself, and he's worked with a fractional engineer at an average of about 11 hours per week over the course of the last year. As of August of this year, he is at a $5 million ARR run rate, all with 11 hours of fractional hiring. By figuring out exactly where it worked to hire fractionally, which was his mobile app, his web application, I'm sorry. He doesn't have a mobile application, but where it was important to keep things core, which is building relationship with different brewers, different breweries that are actually handling the distribution of these craft brews. He's a craft brewer himself, and he wanted to build a platform for craft breweries to send beers to each other and send to different distributors. And he decided to build a piece of software to manage this all. And looking a year later, he's at 5 mil ARR. So just one example of many of where this can work. So let's talk about where it can work, where it can't. We're going to kind of use the style of red no, green yes. So fractional work really doesn't work for strategy. Strategy is deciding where you want your company to be in 5 years, or in 1 year, or in many years. That really doesn't work well with somebody that might not be around for that long. By nature, fractional hiring means you start small and can kind of work your way up and down. And that doesn't work for core decision makers. You can absolutely ask somebody that you're hiring fractionally for advice on, say, do we build a mobile app or do we build a web app in the software world? But I would leave that decision core, because it affects the company and those that are with the company for a long time. Execution, on the other hand, so once you've decided we want to build an iPhone app, or we want to design a specific process or piece of software, execution against that strategy is viable for fractional work. Long-term and short-term are an easy way to decide kind of where it fits, where it doesn't fit. If you need somebody around for years, there's just risks around hiring fractionally. If somebody's only committing for 5 hours or 10 hours or 20 hours a week, the chances of them sticking around versus somebody that's went through a long onboarding, gets benefits, is being promised to really be invested in by the company as well. That's a solid differentiator for, should I hire traditional or can I hire fractionally here? Sync and async first, and I apologize for that typo. I'm gonna magically fix it back here. Oh, that didn't save. That should say async first on the right side. So sync and async, if you're a team or working on something that really requires constantly speaking with each other, constantly being on calls, that really doesn't work when you've really got a part of someone's schedule, not their schedule and their intention in its entirety. Button seat and remote okay. Getting to the office is like onboarding. It takes time and somebody needs to invest in that. And if you're working with somebody for a long time, that's perfectly reasonable to expect. Or if you're working with somebody on a sprint, it can be okay for fractional as well. But generally speaking, this is a solid way to also decide if it's okay or not for your hiring. And then longboarding, quick onboarding. If it takes somebody 3 months to really be able to contribute to whatever you're working on, that's probably not great for fractional hiring, because you'll hire fractionally for them to learn that, and it'll probably take them longer if they're not fully committed. So I'd make sure that the kind of work that you're hiring for fractionally is quick onboarding work. And then this one gets a little tricky, because you don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. So it's impossible to know every single skill set that you'll be hiring for. But this is a good rule of thumb, especially in the early stages of hiring fractionally, if you're hiring a first person. If you're a designer yourself, you can absolutely hire a fractional designer to then execute against things that you decide. If you say, I'm going to design the onboarding experience, the profile screen, the payments experience, once you've got a general sense of how something should look, you can absolutely hire someone fractionally to take over one of those pieces and run with it and own that, because you can manage it, you can edit it if you need to, you can get it to a final state and still have control over it. Same thing with engineering. If you're a developer yourself, you can probably hire any kind of engineers fractionally. If you're not a developer yourself, I would recommend, if you can design something with your team or on your own, you can hire front-end engineers. So they're implementing things that you're designing. But if you really can't evaluate the result, like if you're a non-technical founder, I wouldn't hire a back-end engineer. It takes too long to be able to see the results of the work, to value good versus bad. That's something where, unless you yourself have those skills, or you have someone that you trust, or have someone internally that can evaluate good versus bad, I'd be careful on hiring fractionally for something that you just don't know at all. High security and low security, I would go into hiring fractionally, trusting people the same as you would hiring traditionally, but just the nature of kind of short-term plugging people in and out work. If it's high security work, probably not a great idea to hire short-term and fractionally. And then I spend most of my time building software, designing software. So I know that a lot of the audience here are working on early stage startups, and software might be a part of what you're spending your budgets and your time on. So I want to do kind of a deep dive on hiring fractionally specifically for software. Everything above this applied for whatever kind of hiring you want to do. Like some of the illustrations that you've seen here, we hire fractionally for an illustrator. He's fantastic. It's not something that we could afford or should do full time, but when we need illustrations, we ramp him up. And then when we don't, he works with other customers. So this is going to be specifically for software development. Kind of using that same construct that we used before. If you're running a software startup, the last thing you want to fractionalize or outsource is a CEO. That's strategy, that's decision making. A software architect, I wouldn't fractionalize that either. That's somebody who's deciding, do we build an iPhone app or an Android app? If we build an iPhone app, do we build this with Swift, or do we use something like React Native or Flutter? Making those kind of decisions on what languages, what frameworks we're using, those will affect other people that will work with your software down the line. So I'd be careful on fractionalizing something like that. And then this one is for on the design side. This one's specific. So UX design, which is saying how things are going to fit together, how things are going to hit priority in a piece of software. That's, in my opinion, hard to fractionalize because that's along the lines of strategy. It's taking an intangible idea and describing how does it tangibly work before you even get to the pixels of what a design is. But then the pixels behind that design, that actually is something that I think you can fractionalize. If there is a wireframe or a user experience flow of this is how a product should work, this is what's most important to the customers of my product, that gives enough strategy for execution against that and filling in the pixels of how something should work. I pulled up this screen, which is Turtle's app, showing how just one of our projects, and last week, just how we spent our time, just that you can see that I'm not just talking about hiring fractionally, we literally do it. So this is last week, filtered to who worked on our app. These are 2 front-end developers, a back-end developer, and a designer. And as you can see, all 4 of them are totaling less than 40 hours total in last week. I'm full-time and spend more than full-time. My co-founder is full-time and spends more than full-time on the back end. But we constantly hire part-time fractional people to fill in our web application, our mobile application, parts of our back end. And then I handle UX and our designer handles the pixels just as described above. I think this works over time. Again, this is just one project, but I kind of zoomed out and changed those dates to last year. And we've got over 1,000 hours kind of building this construct. You'll see a couple more people here that weren't represented in the prior screen, just kind of show the nature of you may ramp up, you may ramp down, you may start working with people, stop working with people. That's part of fractional hiring. And I think it's on startups to make that work for themselves and to set up the structure for how that works in their team. And how that works alongside core team members too. This is not a replacement for full-timers and core team members. I think this is a complement, and I think the companies that can think about hiring both core and fractional are the ones that are going to be able to move most efficiently. You know, Jason in Craft Coalition, he happened to have one engineer and he focused on just one version of the product, and he was able to run an entire team just fractionally, but he's still full-time. He's still the one that's putting all his time into this. So, you know, it's not like a total replacement for just anything can be done fractionally. I think that becomes a very slippery slope. And if you go on systems like Upwork or freelancer.com, you can search just about any kind of skill. I'd be careful about which skills you do search. Now, specific to software, I like this little like X-ray diagram of what software even is, so that we can use this to think about what you can and can't fractionalize. I would say the further you are to, so first off, what are we looking at here? If you were to look at an iPhone app, we can kind of break it down as, at some point there was an idea that probably came in through as a wireframe. At some point that was designed. So this is the UX and the idea phase. At some point that was designed. At some point the front end was built. So there's iPhone code or Android code that's actually showing this. And then there's backend code and there's data behind that. So the closer you are to the edges, the least friendly that is for fractionalizing. So you're really setting strategy at this kind of wireframe and setting just what is this thing even? Like, you're pressing a button to do what? But by the time that you do set that strategy, by the time that you have those wireframes, you can fractionalize the design of it. In my opinion, you can fractionalize the front end of it. Setting how do we store our data, where do we store our data, what systems are we even using to interface with our data, what backends, what languages are we even using to build that backend, making those decisions, I would keep core, would not fractionalize. But if you have someone technical in-house, like a CTO or an architect or somebody like that, I think you can fractionalize the actual execution of building some of those backends and how they interface between your data and your front end. And I would keep your core time on the highest leverage activities. So this is something I call the 10x rule of software dev. Basically says, if you're going to spend an hour wireframing something, whether you do it yourself, whether you hire a fractional designer or a full-time designer, they'll probably spend 10 hours designing it. And then if you hire an engineer or do it yourself, or do it with a full-time engineer, it'll probably take about 100 hours to build. This is totally like a rough estimate, back of the napkin rule, but it repeats itself over and over. Yes, there's a pretty wide margin of error there, depending on the details, but this happens all the time. If you spent a couple hours wireframing an idea to get it just right and production ready, meaning a developer knows exactly how every pixel will look, it'll easily, if you spent 2 or 3 hours in wireframe, it can easily be 20 to 30 hours of actual design. And then by the time that you've either connected to an existing backend or worked with backend developers to get that ready, easily could be 300 hours to implement something like that. So keep this in mind, and just thinking about what you should keep core, what you should decide on yourself, what can be fractionalized, what you should fractionalize. The stuff that's highest leverage on the early stage are things that I would not recommend fractionalizing, outsourcing, no matter how you do it. And I would use this method, especially if you're a software startup building something early stage. I would use this method of moving through your iterations and your cycles. It's called the skateboard method. It essentially says, instead of building like all the subcomponents of what you think your software and your product will be, start with the cheapest way to get your customers from point A to point B. It's similar to the lean methodology of just what is your MVP. The nuance is, it's not just about getting the cheapest product out there. It's about learning from those iterations, then deciding, well, once we build a skateboard, well, now we can ask our customers and actually know stability is most important. And once stability is most important, it's speed. And you know what? Speed's even more important. But now we need other passengers to sit in there. You learn as you go, and you might get to the same end result, but this way you get to the right end result if you're lucky. This way you get to the right end result because you actually informed yourself and your team with more information and make those next decisions. It's like getting to the next horizon so that you can make those next decisions in the most informed way possible. The other thing, just as a software startup, I would recommend in those early stages where you have the most leverage, is get great at wireframing. I think this is an activity that any founder, any member of a founding team or core team member can learn. It's trying to describe something visually in the simplest grayscale type of elements, but it gets an intangible idea out of your head and into somebody else's. And then whether you work with full-timers, whether you fractionalize, doesn't matter. You already at least are talking about the same exact thing. So those wireframes typically turn into designs. Those designs then turn into software. But I think that early stage of wireframing, anybody can do. It doesn't have to be done in a specific kind of software. People who are artistic and can draw by hand can absolutely do it by hand and take pictures. If you're more familiar in like spreadsheets and you're building an admin type tool, I think you can wireframe something in a spreadsheet just fine. You're really just trying to get something from like an idea, and a symptom for that is like you find yourself writing 10-page or 20-page requirements where it describes everything. Like, it's going to take somebody way too long to understand that. And if it takes somebody way too long to understand that, they probably won't implement the right thing. Something will get lost in translation versus a visual like this. Yeah, it's ugly and grayscale, but I can see that there's people, there's hours, I can move weeks. I think this is actually a wireframe of the hours screen that I showed you earlier. And then lastly, if you are working on an early stage product and you haven't moved through the design phase, I would look at UI frameworks. The one I have up right now is Material UI. What it lets you do is, instead of moving through the wireframe and design stage of a business, which is costly, and then implementing those designs, you get to kind of choose a pre-built set of components that are already coded in a specific web language. There's ones that are specific for mobile. I don't think you can build the next Uber or Facebook using one of these, but I think you can build the first version of it. And it's a much faster first version than going through the traditional wireframe design implement phases. You're able to find a UI framework that you like, kind of study its components, know that you've got a table, you've got avatars, you've got cards. So with Material, basically your app is going to look like Google or a Google app. And if you're okay with that, and you'd like to move much faster from something, you can focus your time on studying and learning these components, piecemealing them together for a product instead of moving through those traditional first phases of the software. And then once you do move that and figure out what's most important to your customers, what isn't, you can always still go through those custom design phases anyway. I'm a huge proponent of build it as quickly and cheaply as possible, learn as much as you can, and then iterate from there. Last couple of things I'll leave you with. So specific to software, learn to wireframe, and then generally speaking, again, I'm not saying you don't need core team members, you need core founders to set strategy and all, but outside of that, not everything requires a full-timer. I just ask you, as you're building your teams, as you're being as efficient as you can be with your budget for growth, listen back to some of those stories, dig into more, just ask yourself, do I really need a full-timer for everything that we're working on? That's all I have for the presentation. My weapon of choice is Twitter. So you can find me Vlad from Turtle. Happy to connect there, answer any questions. My DMs are open if you're building products. I love seeing early stage founders get things off the ground and build ideas into real companies. And we've seen it over and over and over again on Turtle. So happy to help if you have any ideas, any questions, etc. Inbox is open. I'm going to stop screen share because I think you got some questions for me.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Vlad. That was a lot of actually great information and really specific to, the field that we're talking about, or the concept that we're talking about, I should say, but also I learned some things about, just even terminology that's used, I think if people have been watching this series, you know that I am not a software engineer. I am nowhere close to a software engineer, but it's always like nice to know. And it, I felt like I was being educated on how to do
Jason's not a software engineer, and he built a $5 million a year business after a year of 11 hours of fractional hiring. So
yeah,
as long as you can learn the concepts and set the strategy, I think you can be an engineer. Just kind of dig into it.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, and thanks for sharing. And that was a great deck. I really enjoyed the use of your turtle, the little character that continued through all the pages. But yeah, we do have some questions actually, and we'll probably use the presentation as a launching off point. And then as always, our audience who's watching virtually, please send in any comments, questions that you would have for Vlad. But I think we're gonna kick off with a pretty high level question, which is, what's the key difference between fractional hiring and more traditional outsourcing? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. So I'll first kind of define in my eyes what traditional outsourcing is, and then we can compare. So I think there's two types of traditional outsourcing. One is you're a larger company, and instead of having your office in the country where you're at, you have an office somewhere else where it's cheaper. So common in the US is outsourcing to India. So instead of having a office in the US, you set up an office in India. Instead of having 40 engineers in the US, you have 40 engineers in India. That's one type. And then the other type is going on a platform like Upwork or freelancer.com. For the first type, I think it's different than fractional because you're actually hiring full-timers. They just happen to be in a different country. So it's actually not fractional, it's just outsourcing. The second type, though, hiring on Upwork, you can hire fractionally on Upwork. The key difference is I don't think Upwork and similar systems have evolved to handle the operations of actually working with someone. You go on there and it's essentially a search box and you find someone and everybody has 5 stars. And that looks great, and it might help them press a button and make the sale. But then what do you do once you're actually working together? You got to set up your own systems of, well, let's work exactly this number of hours per week. This is how we're going to handle onboarding. This is how we're going to handle task management. This is how we're going to handle chat. This is how we're going to handle billing. I think if you're a company that's willing to figure all that out up front before you go and search for people on Upwork and vet them and all that, I think you need to be in control of the infrastructure that you set for how you work with someone, not just use one of those systems. So traditionally, I guess comparing again to traditional outsourcing of actually setting up shop in a different country, different from fractional in that this isn't actually with full-timers. You're thinking about how do you hire outside of just the 40-hour construct, but similar in the sense that you might hire someone overseas. Fractional can be overseas, it can be domestic. And then compared to something like Upwork or one of those freelancer marketplaces, I think you can find someone to work with, but it's on you to vet them and to set the infrastructure for how you're going to work with them exactly.
Right. Yeah, and I think, well, the idea of remote working generally, I think, has come and gained a lot more visibility and attention just in the last 6 months. I think it's safe to say for, I think we're all aware at this point, COVID is a thing. It's going to be here for a little while, right? So, everyone that I know, including myself, we've all been working remotely. And taking it a step further than that, the fractional hiring thing, I think, is interesting because you're not only working remotely maybe, but also, as you mentioned, asynchronously. And, it also seems to me that as a fractional worker, I don't know if that's the right term, but you might have more flexibility yourself to kind of create your own schedule or create your own sort of set of projects, right, on the other side. So probably gives some flexibility to both ends, employer and employee. So
we, I think Emily from our team is listening in, our CMO, who's written a bunch of stories of our freelancers and people who have worked on Turtle. And there's just story after story of, I work 20, 25 hours a week. I live by the beach. I go surfing every morning. I don't think that fits everyone. Some people want to work as many hours as they can and make as much as they can, or join a company where they work with someone for 20 years and that's how they build their career. But there's also a group of people who don't want that. And I don't think the opportunity has been there for them up until recently to work that way.
Right. And I think the world is finding out that it is possible, actually, that people can still get their work done and be productive.
It is. I mean, look, it doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't work for every company. Like, I think a lot of people really, first, well, so we're working remote in the pandemic right now. This is like, I've been working remote for many years. This is not as fun as remote work was when I could go to a coffee shop and work from there, or co-work with a friend, or go to an office for a day or two. Like, that was great. This is remote work in a pandemic. This is different, but I think it has shown that tech has come a long way in making it possible. And yet a lot of it sucks and parts of it suck, and it doesn't, you don't get that human interaction. And for a lot of industries, that's really hurting how people work together. Yeah. But generally speaking, we are able to get a lot of work done, and a lot of industries really aren't getting hit, at least not operationally.
Right. Yeah. And actually, on that note, circling back to an earlier point you made about, I think in your presentation, there are some points about security. And then also just recently we were talking about communication. I would imagine that if you are a fractional worker or, hiring a fractional worker, that communication piece gets like triply as important as it is normally, right? Because you have to make sure that they are executing whatever vision you have in your head. And
totally.
So, yeah, could you talk to us a little bit more about
so I think there's a great resource out there that I can't take credit for. It's GitLab's remote handbook. I think it's handbook.gitlab.com. They're the largest all remote company out there now. I think there's something like 1,200 people, over 1,000 people. I think last year they got the #1 seat. Yeah. They describe async first and write everything down. That's not for fractional, that's just for remote, because it carries a lot of the same constraints, and that people are going to be in different time zones. So whether you're working 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day and somebody else is working 2 hours a day, or you're working 8 hours a day and they're working 8 hours a day, but you're doing that at a plus 10-hour delta, either way, you're just not going to get sync time. So in the general rule is go async first, and where you can allow for sync time, absolutely make use of it. Absolutely accommodate each other in your time zones and your schedules to sync up when you need to. But it's strategically thinking about, what do we really need a meeting for? What can we write out instead? What can we handle by chat and handle asynchronously? What can actually wait 24 hours and what can't?
Yeah.
Kind of using that thinking of, can this wait 24 hours? Can this not? If you're really, really methodical about that, there's a lot more that fits into the can wait 24 hours bucket than not.
Right. And does your company, does Turtle have any specific solutions or thoughts around how to make that asynchronous working, or, you know?
Yeah, I mean, we built task management, chat, and budgeting software that is this all in one. I don't think we're the only way to do it. I think you can go and find good people on it, really vet for the people on Upwork, set up your own systems with Slack, set up your own systems with Trello or Asana or other project management tools. The reason that we built a platform to do it is that's a lot of steps. That's a lot of steps for both sides. And when you might only be working with someone for 5 hours a week or 5 hours total, that's just a lot to set up to get things right. And yeah, if a company wants to, they can go ahead and set up all those processes, but we wanted to create something where we're really fulfilling this vision of you get to send a link and get to work. And behind a contract on Turtle, you see your rates, you see who you're working with, and then you press a button and you get your entire task management, chat, and billing platform all in one.
Okay.
So we build our own software for it. Outside of that, there are great tools like I love Loom. Loom is a tool that you can use where you get to record not only your screen, but also there's a little avatar of yourself in the corner. You can turn that on, you can turn that off. But instead of saying, hey, can we catch up for 5 minutes? You can just record it. Like, let's say that you worked on a wireframe and you want a designer to work on it. Instead of saying, hey, let's catch up when you wake up or when you're in the office, you can say, hey, here's a Loom recording of me just walking through everything. It's just a screencast. It's just they made it where you can like go to your taskbar, press a button, and record a quick video. So that's a great piece for asynchronous. Slack is great. Slack's a great chat tool. Microsoft Teams is great. I mean, I'm a total optimist, and I'm like more and more great tools for async. I don't think that they need to look at each other as competitors. I think that they're just making it easier for people to work around the globe and on different time zones. I think they're all great pieces of software. I think Jira is a little much. That's like a personal opinion. So I would stay away from that if you're in software, just because I think that works better for like, you really have a unique process that you've built as a dev team or a product team, and you want everyone to stick to that. And for that, Jira might be great. But for when you're really kind of treating things as asynchronous, plug and play, remote first, I would keep things as simple as possible and use chat if you can instead of a task manager. And if you have to use a task manager, use a simple one. Just keep it simple so that if people do swap in and out, it's manageable.
Yeah, as a previous user of Jira myself, I will just say it was an unfortunate experience, and I'll leave it at that. But yes, philosophically, I think I agree with you on those. So thinking about it again, maybe keeping it pretty high level, could you share with us, are there some industries where fractional hiring is maybe better suited than others, and maybe some examples from your experience on that?
Yeah, I kind of use that security and long-term rule to separate there. So like if you're in a security industry in general, I think that's something where you work for the government. That's a really hard thing to fractionalize. You're really like, let's make the most extreme example, you work for the CIA. They're going to take years to vet you to make sure that you pass all their checks and balances. You make sure that they you're coming in every day, sitting there physically, not taking any like. I actually think that most of them are back in the office even during this time, and probably had a lot of trouble working remotely, and were the last two. But I think a good way to think about it would be like, who couldn't work remote during the pandemic? Restaurants, healthcare workers, something where you do need physical touch is just a core part of the business. Those are all areas where it's really hard to fractionalize. It's really hard to go to remote. And just areas where like everyone's a strategist. Education, I think it's actually really hard to fractionalize, where somebody's building a lesson plan, building the structure of how somebody should learn. I think that's something that really requires digging in and giving it your all and all your efforts. And then the industries where it works well for, I think software is great. And I think that's the one where like most software developers already work in front of a computer. So you can give yourself and the other people a lot of opportunity, the people that are actually working a ton of opportunity by just realizing that if somebody can work through a computer and do the majority of their job through a computer, they can probably do it online the same as they can through an office, and they can probably do it in 5, 10, 15, 20 hours a week, the same as they can do it in 40. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Um, and yeah,
Oh, sorry, and
yeah.
couple that are already have been fractionalizing for a long time. That
Yeah.
lawyers, accountants. There's I think their systems have evolved for decades and decades, and law firms have been around since way before the internet has. So they kind of built their structures around, well, we need a lot of overhead for making sure to be able to sell an hour or 5 hours or 10 hours of time and to make that profitable, doable for the company. Some won't do an hour, some won't take customers that can't engage for a certain retainer or for a certain rate. But the reason that you see those rates at accounting firms, at law firms, at companies like McKinsey are because they're fractionalizing their time down and having to make up for it with margin. And that same infrastructure that I think you can now create with project management tools, with task management tools, with online hiring, I think they've had to create on their own in more traditional ways, but they actually have been doing a lot of fractional hiring or providing fractional hiring for their customers for decades before the internet even existed.
Right. Right. Yeah. So the concept itself, I mean, actually, do you know if the term fractional hiring has that been around for a while, or is that a new?
I don't know. I get like inconsistent stuff when I Google it. There have been like fractional like CTOs and CMOs that offer their time up. That's what I've seen more often, but those are pretty strategic roles.
Yeah. Mhm.
And yeah, when I Google around it, I'm a little surprised at what I see there. I think you could get advice from someone who's a fractional CTO, but to have someone actually work as a fractional CTO or a fractional CMO, if that goes below, say, half time ish,
Mhm.
it's really hard to strategize with less time than that. If it's like, if somebody can probably work 25, 30, 20 hours and make that their number one thing and then do other things on the side and still be a core strategic decision maker. But once there's something else that's number one for them, that's where they're
Yeah.
really not a strategist. They should really be focusing more on execution.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Great. So let's say that I am an employer that wants to proceed with fractional hiring from a more maybe tactical level. Are there certain pitfalls to avoid? Are there best practices that you can share with us in your experience?
Yeah. So before focusing on the tools, like I see this pretty often where everybody's like, should I use Asana? Should I use Jira? Should I use
Yeah.
Trello? Should I use Slack? Like people really focus on the tools. And I think you should first focus on the process and just in general, how you and your team are going to think about this. Um, if you sit down with your team and you decide that, you know what, fractional is only going to work for this specific use case, or maybe it doesn't work at all, like decide that and stick with that strategy with your team before you get into, well, it'll work if we use Trello, but it won't work if we use Jira. That's not the case. Like if you're a really good product manager or a project manager, or just in general manager on a team, whether you're working fractionally or not, whether you're using Trello or a piece of paper and email, you'll be able to manage the process. I think it all starts with the fundamentals. I think it's deciding which parts can we fractionalize, which can we not. If we can, where do we actually hire from?
Mm.
And if you hire from somewhere, make sure that you're setting up proper vetting processes in the same way that you would for hiring someone traditionally. Not the same in that they're coming to the office and going through the same interview process, but the same in that you're making sure to set up the right asks of them, testing them in the same environments that you'd be working with them in. Like it'll be a unique environment. So having somebody come into the office and test as if they're going to work with you for years, but then have them work at 10 hours a week or 15 hours a week won't work. I would instead set up a mock test that actually shows the like how you would work with them. So the nice thing about hiring someone for 10 hours a week or 15 hours a week is instead of a traditional interview, you could just run the process for a week, run the
Mm.
process for 2 weeks. And that ends up being pretty low risk to you, to the person on the other side. Nobody wants to jump through a bunch of hoops for the opportunity to work
Sure.
5 hours or 10 hours. If they're a high quality person, they're probably going to jump through less and less hoops. So sometimes it's easier to just say, let's work together for a week or 2 weeks, in the same way that we would be working if we worked together for longer. So instead of an interview, you're really thinking about things as trials.
Mm.
So to summarize there, I'd put strategy and infrastructure of how you run your company and your org over the tools that you use. Um, that first above anything else.
Yeah.
And after that, most things will fall into place, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. And I think you kind of talked around this maybe or mentioned it briefly in your slides, but um, what's the what is your opinion, I guess, and what's your advice for companies who maybe want to mix and match? So can you hire the fractional worker, like X% of your company is fractional and then the other percent is traditional or full-time? Yeah.
Absolutely. And you can even do that with the same roles. So like Facebook spends $20 billion a year in R&D. I don't know. I think it's something like that. I think it's like $6 billion per quarter or something insane. I don't know if the 20 is the quarterly figure or the annual figure. That's a really, really big number. So no matter how much you're paying each one of those engineers, that's a lot of different engineers.
Yeah.
And I think if you really dug into what are those engineers doing, there's probably a mix of who can work full-time and who might not necessarily need to work full-time. Facebook, because of privacy and security and all that, for them, they kind of, the high security, low security rule becomes a factor. So that's probably why they make a lot of the full-time hiring decisions and don't fractionalize as much. But you can absolutely mix and match. You can mix and match at the role level. So if you're an early stage startup, CTO, CEO, in-house full-time, everything else, if you're a product company, could probably be fractionalized at the early stage, especially if you have kind of a product managing CTO or CEO who can wireframe, and then even the design can be fractionalized, especially the implementation around front end can be fractionalized. And at that point, you've got kind of core C levels and then fractionalizing the execution against that. As your company scales, you might need somebody to start strategizing the specific architecture of the iPhone app or the Android app. And at that point, you actually need a full timer in each one of those roles. But then to complement them or to not stretch them too thin or to simply run faster, you can then start pairing a full-time, so a core iOS leader with fractional iOS. So not only can you fractionalize, mix and match on different roles, certain roles will fit full-time and certain roles will fit fractional, but you can also do it at the specific role level. So you might have one lead designer and then everybody under them does not necessarily need to be a full-timer, especially if you're an early stage startup where your headcount might be 5 or 10 people. Kind of the closer you get to a headcount of one, the more and more this matters.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yep, makes sense. And theoretically, would you recommend or how would you advise somebody who wants to only hire fractionally? So 100% fractional, is that recommended in your opinion?
Generally no. Like, unless you're somebody that is going to do all the strategy yourself and can do that yourself, I think there are people that can do it, and like the case with Jason, he has, and all the more to him. I personally don't think I can do that. I think it gets lonely, and I think it just one person can't cover every skill best. I'm someone that can't do that. Like, I don't know everything. I wish I did. I don't. I never will. So generally speaking, I don't think that everything should be hired fraction. I think the person starting an org or a company should always be full time. So at least one full timer. Ideally, there's at least 2, so that there's some redundancy of skill. There's you're not getting lonely in building a company, which is just hard to do in itself. There's a lot of challenges going to face. So no, I do not recommend going entirely fractional. I think a blend is ideal. And just thinking about what parts are long-term strategic and what parts can we fit under execution. I know I gave you a lot of different parameters to kind of say this works, this doesn't, but the most important one in my opinion is strategy versus execution. Yeah. If it's strategic and long-term, it should probably stay core, or you should get advice on it and then make the decision yourself. If it's execution, that becomes something that's fractional friendly.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. And, I don't think life would be as fun if you knew everything, off the bat. So probably better this way. Okay. Yeah. So then, thinking about the topic or the theme, I guess, around everybody being sort of a distributed worker and nobody's in the same geographic location. I think this comes up with remote working, but maybe also fractional working as well. How can I, if I'm an employer, build, culture or a relationship with team members if the work is all fractional? Can I do that? How do I do that?
You can. I think, I don't even want to say tougher, it's just different. There was a thread going, there's a chat thread going around with the team that they want to play. There's some new viral game with an imposter. I can't remember what it's called, but they're organizing this game night on Saturday where a bunch of them are going to get together and play this game, and I'm going to try to join them as well. I think it's called Among Us. It's
okay, yeah,
some viral game that's going around now, but online game. You can play multiplayer mode, and I didn't push for that. It was team members just suggesting that on their own and joining up on it. And I think culture is naturally really hard to build, and it's something that you got to think about from day one. And like really delicately, you can't force it. You have to let it build organically. And I think the same principles apply to a fractional team. Where can it be done? Yes, it's different though. You can't get everyone in the same room for beers and
Right.
going to a restaurant to eat together, but you absolutely can set up game night or a chat thread about something. I guess the laziest example is Slack's hashtag random. Um, Everybody has that room, and that's specifically built for building some culture around an async team. I don't think that's like you should start and stop there, but it's an example of just, yeah, it works. You can share memes there. You can have a fun conversation that's not just work. And then just encourage people talking directly. I think a lot of culture comes from like water cooler talk in the traditional sense, and water cooler talk in the digital world is a direct message.
Yeah.
And if you're setting up something where you hire a designer and they can't talk to the engineer and everything has to go through you, not only are you setting up an uphill battle for your operations, you're also just getting in the way of natural culture that could build.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was going to say maybe, I don't know if you guys want to pivot to building something that'll let you have virtual game nights. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, there's I mean, also just to kind of zoom out and level set fractional remote, um, the internet hasn't been around for that long, and the internet hasn't been good for that long, and computers and video and audio haven't been good for that long. While the 40-hour work week, I mean, people were fighting for a 40-hour work week almost 200 years ago, and they finally got a 40-hour work week about 100 years ago. And all these industries, including law and accounting that we've talked about, they've had a lot of time to develop. As
Yeah.
far as hiring someone online, you could maybe do it for the first time in 95, 96 if you found somebody on your own. Elance and Odesk came around, I think, in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And so it's been 20 years max of even being able to think about how to set this up. So I think we're, yes, there's systems where you can hire someone and those are massive companies and all that. But in the grand scheme of things, we are so early in just figuring out how to make remote fractional work. But I absolutely believe that it's the future of how we should be thinking about forming teams.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So we are at the time actually for our audience questions, and we've had one come in. An audience member says, relying on part-time workers or contractors is commonly seen as a strategy for companies to avoid paying for benefits that full-time workers would be entitled to, and therefore as moral. Is Turtle taking any steps to address this? Okay, so the question is around benefits and how that fits in with fractional work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a difficult one to figure out when hiring fractionally, because you get into, in the U.S., if you hire someone as an employee, there are specific rules federally and at a state level of exactly what you offer somebody and what you don't. As you move to other countries, that gets more complicated. On the benefits side, that's not something that we specifically focus on, but there are companies like remote.com specifically focuses on they work with law teams in different countries to set up, this is exactly how you can hire and offer benefits to somebody in different geographies. Deal, I think, handles some of the benefit side, but they're more on just contractors themselves as well. But if you're in the US and you're hiring someone part-time, you don't need to make them a contractor. They don't, you can, I mean, please talk to a lawyer and a hiring professional in whatever country and state you're hiring in. I'm not a lawyer, and please don't take this as any kind of legal advice. I think I have to say that in these cases. But if you're hiring someone as a 20-hour, a fractional 15-hour week employee, they can still be an employee. They can still have benefits. And when we hire in the U.S., that's exactly how we do things. But once you go international, you really have to understand the laws of each country that you're hiring in, what benefits are required at sometimes, what benefits should be offered. Something that we do at Turtle is because we are earning some margin on every hour that's transacted, at least we're making sure that if somebody tests us in the network, they're paid pass or fail. So if somebody tries to apply to join Turtle, we're actually testing them by running them through our app, running them through our process. If we've asked them to take a test, just like I said, instead of an interview, work with them, we hire people for 10 hours and we pay them for 10 hours, pass or fail. In onboarding, we'll cover some of the onboarding fees if we know that there's going to be a long-term relationship on the other side of it. So just making sure that both sides are kind of being fair by each other, but we don't directly offer those benefits because we don't see ourselves as the actual employer. We see ourselves as an interface between somebody hiring somebody else.
Sure, sure. Like a broker. Okay, yeah. Yeah, and I was actually, that brought a thought to mind, which is for employees, so fractional workers who, oh, did I lose you?
Sorry, no, I'm still here. By the way, I was just going to say, like, Emily was sending me notes on this yesterday, and just been following the news on this. Just what's happening with I think, Prop 22 in California. For whoever asked that question, just following along, like how much money Lyft and Uber are putting into basically saying you should be able to keep hiring contractors without benefits, to the other side of the conversation saying they all need to be employees. I think there's something that's sort of missing that conversation with it's, well, you could have hourly employees as well,
Yeah.
which I can understand why Lyft and Uber don't want to take on that responsibility, but it should be an option and part of the discussion as well. I don't think it's like this all in, but I do agree with parts of what the Uber CEO he wrote a New York Times piece on just the classification systems have gotten incredibly outdated. And for somebody who is working part-time, like we would love to eventually set up something where they can opt into benefits and that is structured into how they're being paid on a fractional network. But that's a whole other beast to bite off, and we're an early stage startup ourselves and totally practicing what I preach here on skateboarding and being efficient and hiring fractionally. And I hope we're able to face that challenge one day. And if somebody else is able to solve it, we will gladly use their services. Otherwise, maybe one day we'll be able to solve that too.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And yeah, that makes sense. And I agree that, it's probably labor in general has changed a lot, as you highlighted in your presentation. And so, it's a different century.
It's a different world. It was,
exactly.
If you really kind of geek out on the 8-hour work week and the 40-hour work week, just seeing like how much of those changes happened around the Industrial Revolution, World War I, and the Soviet Revolution, how much of that happened around even the French Revolution, and just how core that was to new capitalistic systems being built and people being taken advantage of in a lot of cases, and fighting back and forming labor unions to make sure that they did have some regulation and rights. And at the time, I think that made a ton of progress for people. I do think we're absolutely at a time now, though, where we need to just reevaluate some of those systems and say, okay, like we made these before the internet existed. Work has changed. We're all working online now, whether we like it or not. Maybe we need to think about how those constructs should work.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And actually, that's a good segue, because I wanted to pivot a little bit in the last little bit of time that we have together to talk a little bit more about your own journey, actually, as an entrepreneur and as a co-founder. And how, can you give us a little overview of how you ended up in this space, actually, and how you
started
thinking about disrupting labor?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I got into entrepreneurship pretty early. I had like a real job for a year or two out of school, but I was itching for my way out pretty early on. And I started a first company called Darwin Apps when I was in my early 20s, which was a consulting company for startups. Started as that way. So startups building software. We tried to form it as a company where we built software, we took the profits, and we built our own ventures. I learned after probably too many years that it's very hard to do two things best. So around the time that I was in grad school at King, I stepped away from running Darwin Apps, which by that time we had grown from working with startups to working with companies like Audi, Seagate, AT&T, and had grown into a larger business, and wanted to focus on something where I can just focus on one product and one mission and one goal. And that's where I formed Turtle. And I formed Turtle with my co-founder, Venkat, who had a really similar journey. He had a consulting shop. It did well. He just didn't want to run a service business for the rest of his life. So he wanted to run a product business. And we really digged away at what is it that we do well, what is it that the world needs, and trying to find the intersection of those. And we can build and design software. We know how to find great talent around the world, no matter if they work 10 hours or 40 hours, or if they're in the US or if they're abroad. And how can we piece that together into a scalable business that benefits a lot of other companies? And it started as Turtle.dev, which was just startups hiring freelance software developers. We use the profits of that to build the task management, chat, and billing software that everyone's using to work together, to onboard, to sign contracts, accept them, to have everything they need to work together behind those contracts. And then earlier this year, we launched Turtle OS, which is the platform side of our business. So now it's not just startups hiring freelance software developers. Now we have a data science team that sells their services through this kind of one-click experience. We have an illustrator, the same illustrator that we've actually used for all the turtle animations that you've seen. He sells his time, but he has a specific way that says, to work fractionally with me, this is what I ask of my customers. And then to hire fractionally for software developers, we use a turtle template, a task that says, if you want to hire engineers at 10 hours a week plus, which is our minimums, you need to be able to design and you need to be able to architect the backend or use a system like Firebase or pre-built backend. So everybody kind of has their requirements for, if you want to hire me fractionally, this is what I expect of you. So instead of a system like Upwork, where I think it's, if you're a customer and you have a credit card, you can hire. I don't think that works in the traditional world, so I don't think it should work in the remote and fractional world. I think both sides should do their best to do right by each other, set the rules for how they want to do their best work and what they expect of the other side, and ideally have an easy way to do that. And our view on it was build a platform that makes that easy for both sides. Yeah. So now we're focused entirely on TurtleOS being the platform that other service businesses, whether they're one person doing their own illustration or it's a 10-person data science and machine learning team in Europe. That's one of our first sellers on there. Just making it really easy for them to just kind of set up their own service business in the same way that Shopify made it easy to set up a store. Shopify was the first to really put all the pieces that you need to set up a website for a store, have everything you need for somebody to view your products, check out your products, and buy your products. And before that, it used to be like you clicked buy now and you'd get an email. Like imagine getting an email form and having to go through this manual ordering process. You're calling a supplier. Amazon changed that. We kind of made everybody cookie cutter and look the same. Shopify then changed that. We gave shop owners the ability to set their own destiny, to set their own design, set their own rates, set their own shipping costs, et cetera, and kind of handle that entirely in one bundle. Our mission is to do the same, but for service. You're able to set how you work with someone, the rules for working with someone, the tools that you use to work with them, how much you charge them, in what ways, what you expect of them, what they should expect of you, and to have a one-click experience to make it all possible in the same way that Shopify gives us like buy now for a product. Just services are very different because they're ongoing. So you really can't focus on just the discovery phase like how Upwork and those systems are focused on. I think the operational phase is just as, if not more important. You spend a little bit of time finding someone, but if you find the right people, you're going to keep working with them over and over and over again.
Right. Yeah. And I think I was thinking about that earlier is in terms of sort of, retention and talent retention is always a big topic too. And if you are a fractional worker, I would assume if you build your own reputation and, you can form that relationship with someone who's hiring, I'm assuming they would want you back, right, for other projects.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're a fractional worker and you set yourself up to do great work and keep getting better and find good customers to work with, people will simply ask to work with you more. We see that on the platform that we built all the time. The best engineers, not only do they get asked for more and more hours or consistent hours, a lot of them get asked to work, to then transition from fractional full-time. I mean, that also happens. People go through different stages in their life, and at some point working 25 hours a week is great, and at some point working 10 hours a week is great, and at some point you want to go all into a company for a decade. I think we now have the tools and the world to be able to pick and choose. And it used to be just work for a company for a decade, and then I think people started jumping around every couple of years, and now I think we finally have a world where you really can choose if you want to work for yourself, if you want to work 10 hours a week, if you want to work 25 hours a week, 40. If you can really decide what makes sense for you in your life at this point in time, I think the tools are out there to make that possible.
Yeah, very cool. And we have just a couple of minutes left, but the hour flew by, but I was going to say, should we end on maybe your top 2 or 3 lessons learned from your journey as an entrepreneur, and your journey through, founding and co-founding Turtle? What are your top 2 takeaways for all our entrepreneurs out there who are listening?
Yeah. So one is, everybody expects that things kind of move like this. And even if you're doing really well, like even if things are moving like this, if you really zoom in, it's less of a line and more of a sine wave. That's just, if you look at things day by day or week by week, I think that's just how it goes. And I mean, maybe other companies, they don't function that way, but both businesses that I built, that's how things go. If you zoom out, hopefully you're moving in the right direction. But if you look a little too deep, you're probably going to give yourself burnout and anxiety that just isn't worth it. So just keep in mind that if you're building a business, if things look like they're moving up and down, just know that that's normal. And just remember that things may move like a sine wave, just as long as you zoom out and things are moving in the right direction. Great. Then other one is, if everything is important, nothing is important. I think that just prioritizing maniacally and getting so good at this is our number one thing, and getting everything else out of the way, I think that is so underdone. I think people constantly feel like there's a rat race and they have to work on everything and do everything and be on every platform. You know, if you're running a social media campaign, like let that simple example, you're better off running a very successful campaign on just Twitter or just on LinkedIn or just on Facebook than spreading yourself too thin. I mean, that's like one very specific example, but just it repeats itself in teams and individual priorities and businesses. Just know what your number one is, make sure that's being communicated to your team, make sure that you're being honest with yourself about that, sitting down with yourself and spending time, you know, whether you meditate or run or have your best thoughts, shower thoughts, whatever. Just make sure that you're being very clear and honest with yourself about what that number one is, because if everything is important, nothing is important, especially when you're a solo founder or have a small team or have a small startup. The smaller you are, the more that matters. And if you're a successful company, that'll probably keep mattering even when you're 1,000 people or 10,000 people.
Yeah.
And the last one is learn to wireframe. I think it's the most underrated skill. And we talked about that already, but just I think it's so easy to learn. And I think so few people do it. If you wanted to learn it, the thing I would recommend is don't practice on your own product. Practice on someone else's product first. Learn the technical skill before you apply it to your own skill. Otherwise, you'll be kind of confusing learning the technical skill with making the strategic and creative decisions of how your product should actually look. So if you're building a video app, take a screenshot of Zoom, wireframe that with some gray boxes, with some annotations, make sure that's clear and communicating priority. The name of the game here is priority, and making sure that priority is being communicated effectively, and then move on and build your own and your own nuances. And you'll kind of say, okay, when I draw a video element, it looks like this. And when I have lists of people who are in that call, it looks like this. But you've now learned the technical side and can now apply it to your own creative side.
Perfect. Well, Vlad, this has been a really fun hour, and I'm so glad that
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having the time to fit us into your schedule, and thanks for telling us about fractional hiring and Turtle. And for those of you watching at home, thank you so much, as always, for joining and for all the questions and your participation. This has been awesome. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you at the next one. But thank you, Vlad. Have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.
Guys, bye, everyone.